Well, it was only when the FBI released numerous photographs and videos of the Boston Marathon bombing suspects last Thursday that any real progress was made in the investigation. Despite the fact that the city of Boston claims to have over 147 surveillance cameras throughout the city, and although records indicate that the city spent nearly $500,000 in 2007 on these high-tech security cameras alone, the best footage of the suspects actually came from privately owned cameras in front of a local restaurant. So does the city of Boston have too few security cameras, too many, or just enough? For more on this, joining me now in our D.C. studio is Jesslyn Rydak, Director of the National Security and Human Rights Council at the Government Accountability Project, and President of CMP Group Investigations, Thomas Ruskin in New York. Thank you for joining me, both of you. Thomas, I'd like to start with you. So the FBI is touting the use of these surveillance cameras to help discover and apprehend the alleged Boston Marathon bombers. So is this surveillance a success, or is the fact that the bombing happened at all a black mark for the so-called surveillance state?
Well, surveillance cameras basically brought this case to a conclusion and brought the people who committed the crime to justice. So how could that be a failure? Furthermore, over the years, like in July 7th of '05, we know that the cameras in London, what they call the Ring of Steel, brought to justice and brought to conclusion and brought the people who were responsible for the bombing in London. So, you know, cameras in our society are now a necessary evil and are going to probably be expanded, and probably Homeland Security dollars as well as municipal dollars will go to building up municipalities' cameras and CCTV systems at this point in time.
And Jesslyn, he did make a point. The Urban Area Security Initiative, which was grant funding from the Federal Department of Homeland Security, funded a lot of the cameras that Boston has. Do you think that this is one of the necessary evils, as Tom said?
Well, it's definitely an evil. I think this whole thing was a spectacular failure of the surveillance state, because despite all the cameras we just talked about, they failed to deter or detect this plot. And while I agree with the other guest that cameras are good for reconstruction, even there we had to crowdsource this manhunt and rely on footage from a lot of private cameras and photographs.
Now, Tom, piggybacking off of what Jesslyn just said, are surveillance cameras supposed to actually prevent crimes through deterrence because people know that they are being watched, or is it supposed to more act as a retroactive discovery? Is that how they've been used in the present by politicians? Is that they have actually been presented to us is as one or the other, or both?
The answer to your question is both. In New York City alone, we have the Downtown Initiative, which is formulated by the New York City Police Department. What it is it's a merger of public and private cameras. What the police department has done is got private corporations to link their camera systems outside of sensitive locations as well as normal buildings in Midtown Manhattan and beam it to a location in Lower Manhattan where the police department and private corporations monitor on a 24-hour basis. The purpose of that is not only to detect crime should a person come and act suspicious outside of a building, let's say like the Empire State Building, and leave a package so that they can respond necessary police officers as well as bomb squad, but it's also to detect or solve the crime should it happen without the prior detection. So it works in both ways.
Now, Jesslyn, how can we really balance this need for privacy, but also the need for safety? Because in retrospect, these cameras were instrumental in finding these people. So how can we balance our safety with what we want as individuals to not be recognized every single time we're on the street?
Well, the cameras helped find people, but again, it was cameras from a lot of private footage from private cameras and surveillance. I think the way you can help do that is by having smart surveillance. I mean, we have spent $700 billion on surveillance since 9/11, and I would submit that the place that really needed to be surveilled was a fertilizer plant. which had not been inspected for more than 5 years. And instead, we have massive, I mean, we have one of the most surveyed events in history with the marathon in terms of cameras, and it didn't detect that person placing the bag. And accident reconstruction is fine, but people are dead by then.
Tom, your response?
It's the most ridiculous hypothesis I've heard in a long time. But along those lines, you know, it's city and metropolitan areas that are most at danger. That's what our past history has shown us. And to build up the surveillance system, anyone who thinks that they walk through the world nowadays and isn't under some kind of surveillance, either by a smartphone or by a CCTV, is really living in a different era than what we're living in now. And I think that if we're smart, we will build up the public as well as private cameras and be able to monitor them to prevent as well as solve crimes that happen.
I don't know which hypothesis you found incorrect. I mean, I think it's completely true, as you conceded, that all the surveillance failed to detect or deter in this case. And what we don't need is more surveillance. You know, we already have the 147 government cameras and numerous private cameras, you know, and again, we have massive data collection. We have fusion centers, and none of these has ever failed to prevent attack. And moreover, you mentioned London, and England had a survey that found, a massive survey of surveillance, that found that surveillance never prevented an actual crime.
Both interesting points. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap the discussion up there. Jessalyn Radak, Director of the National Security at the Human Rights at the Government Accountability Project, and in New York, Thomas Ruskin, a former NYPD detective and president of CMP Group Investigations.